ExamPal.
So as mentioned, my name is David. I'm a senior tutor at ExamPal. I've been a teacher in the business for a few years. And before we really get started into core of this webinar, which are strategies for getting that 700 or more, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the GMAT is and how we as ExamPal view your process towards the GMAT. And how we've built our platform so as to fit that process. And this is important primarily for first timers, but also for people who are retaking it. So what is the GMAT? And what we've found, so we sort of grew up, not just myself, but also others at the company, grew up teaching in regular brick and mortar classrooms for various standardized tests, not just the GMAT. And what we found out is that the one size fits all approach just doesn't work. And there's a few sort of specific pains that yeah, sales issue. There are a few specific pains that students go through when they study for the GMAT. And the first pain is that it's very frustrating. And this is the classic sort of problem that is in the world of education today that sort of many education companies and sort of general trends in society are gearing towards. And this is how do we personalize the learning approach? And especially with GMAT questions, and we'll see this a bit more later on, there are many different ways to solve the same question. So I can teach you a very equation-oriented approach. I can teach you sort of a more logical approach. I can teach you sort of a hacky method. I can teach you several equation-oriented approaches usually. And the question is, which of these approaches resonates most with you? And this is something that is impossible to do in a standardized brick and mortar classroom because basically I have like a syllabus I need to go through and I need to go through all the little bullets and I don't actually know how well each of those bullets fits each person. So this is the first pain with studying for the GMAT in the old approach. The second pain is that your biggest problem in the GMAT is not going to be actually solving the question. So I guarantee you 100% that every single one of you out there, if they had 5, maybe even 10 minutes per question, they could solve all of the questions correctly, but you don't. You have 2 minutes per question. And your biggest enemy in these exams is always time. And this is something that really does need to be personalized. So it's not enough that you know how to solve a question. It is necessary that you also know how to solve the question quickly. And this is something that there must be a personalized aspect to, which is also something that regular brick and mortar classrooms don't do. And the last point, which sort of binds these two issues together, is the question of, especially someone, one of the retakers mentioned time constraints, is that often you don't have all that, you know, you don't have infinite time to study for these exams, especially since many of you are probably working while you're studying. This is not a first, exam for college applicants. This is for people who already have a bachelor's in something or another, and usually also have work experience, and you just don't have time to put into learning everything properly, which is also how life works, honestly. You don't have time for everything. All of these together sort of led us to the understanding and the belief that we need to create a platform that can do things better. And this is why we created ExamPal. This is the motivation behind it. And I'll sort of show you in details how this works later on in a few slides. We study the way you think. And we study the effectiveness of all the different methods, and we try to pick for each student, we sort of guide you towards understanding which tools work best for you. And sort of this is going to be the core topic of this webinar. It's sort of a skill that we label as cognitive flexibility. And basically, to put this into more literal terms, what this means is that you need to have many different tools. So when you approach the GMAT, you're entering the exam with like your toolbox of problem solving tools. And these, again, like I gave a few examples before, these can be how you manipulate equations. These can be the logical rules underpinning, for example, number properties or fractions or triangles, or these can be your reading speed, which is often underlooked but is super critical to getting usually that 700 plus. It's how quickly you can process information, how quickly you can read. And this is, by the way, why we recommend to all of our students to actively read during GMAT preparation. So, spend half an hour to an hour a day just reading. And it's a combination of many other different things, and it's also your decision-making process. So when you're looking at a question, are you capable within the first, say, 20 seconds of looking at a question, hopefully sooner, within the first 10 seconds of looking at a question, of understanding what the question is asking you, and of choosing how you want to approach it. And this is sort of metacognition. This isn't actively the tool, this is which tools should I use. And so all of this thing lumped together that I've been talking about right now, this is what we label cognitive flexibility, and this is what we try to teach all of our students. And this is also, in my opinion, what you should aim to do, whether you choose to study with us or not. And so how do we do it? Again, we've built our course to do this. And so first of all, the lessons are interactive. There are pauses along the way in order to keep you engaged. We start off with the diagnostic phase. And sort of here, I think I'm going to pause for a moment and sort of try to show what I mean by different tools and by cognitive flexibility. So there's a question on the screen. It's sort of a middle question. It's not super easy, it's not super hard. I want you to take a second to look at it. And I want you to take a second to think about it and to tell me not only what you think the right answer is, but why that is the right answer. So what was your approach to solving this question? And sort of, let's see who we have here with us today, how you all think. So for every positive x and y, 3x plus 2y divided by x plus y is between either 0 to 1, 1 to 1.5, 1.5 to 2, 2 to 3, or 3 to 4. So what do you think is the solution to this question? And how would you personally approach this question if you encountered it? If you were to encounter it. All right, so we have a suggestion for an answer, but what was your approach? Sort of, how did you solve the question? Okay, so that's one approach. Pick two numbers. That's one approach. What else? What other solutions are there out there besides picking two numbers? And again, the goal of this webinar for me is to help you understand that there are many, many different tools and to help you realize the types of tools that you can choose and that you should learn. Of course, I can't teach you everything you need to actually get the 700. I can't teach you the material, but what I can give you is the strategy, is sort of the approach that you should take on your route to the 700. And so that is why we're going to talk quite a bit about different ways of solving questions today. Okay, and there's a more equation-oriented approach right there. So, I mean, you guys should all have access to chat and you can just see what your friends, your colleagues are writing. And you're seeing that different people are suggesting different methods of approaching the same question. And there's no right or wrong method. Sort of all of the methods that have been written so far are correct and lead to the correct answer, but they are very different. So let's go over a few of the solutions to this question. This is sort of what we do in the diagnostic phase of our program, which is to say we present you with a question, you answer it, and then we show you several different solutions to this question, along with some feedback, which we'll get into in a second. So one approach to solve this question, which is maybe not too surprisingly something that none of you actively mentioned, is what we like to call the logical approach. It's usually a very wordy type of approach, which deals with the fundamental mathematical properties underlying the question, at least in quant. In verbal, it's a little bit different, and not with sort of algebraic manipulation or with hacking the question, such as plugging in numbers. And in this case, it's talking about the issue of range. So if we were to say make x really, really, really close to 0, so x and y have to be positive, but you make x really close to 0. So basically, all you have is y. All you have is 2y divided by y, which is 2. And conversely, if you make y really, really, really close to 0, and exactly, it's a weighted average, and all you have left is x, then you have 3x over x, which is 3. And therefore, the expression is always going to be between 2 to 3. And as one person put it, the technical term behind this is the weighted average behind x and y. Okay, so this is one type of approach to solve this question. Sort of looking at it, thinking about the underlying mathematical properties and arriving at the correct answer without actually having to go through the equations. And this is what we call the logical approach. The second type of approach, which some of you put different variants of on screen, is a more algebraic manipulation type of approach. And this is what we call precise. It's sort of putting everything into the right equations and then sort of chugging through them. And I've suggested one way on screen, you've suggested another way on chat. They both sort of condense into playing around with the equations. And in this case, sort of if you take off x from the expression, you get to the side on the left, which is 2. If you add y to the expression, you get to the side on the right, which is 3. And again, you're between 2 to 3. And the third type of approach, which was also suggested in chat, is to sort of say, well, I don't actually want to solve this question, either because I don't know how to, because it's a complicated question. This question might not be a complicated question, but sometimes you're looking at questions you just don't know what to do with, or because you think it's going to be much, much faster to pick a number than to actually go through the math of doing stuff. And in this case, I picked x and y equals 1, and then I got the number 2.5, and I eliminated A, B, C, and E, and all that was left is D. And so the key idea behind this completely different type of tool is that if you eliminate all 4 out of the 5 possible choices, then the 5th one has to be right. You can think of this as Sherlock Holmesing the question. And the sort of the fundamental principle behind it is that there must be one correct answer. So this isn't like an open-ended research question. You know that one of your answers is correct, and if you can eliminate 4 of them, then it has to be the 5th one. And if you can arrive to that correct answer, then it doesn't really matter how you got there, so long as you got there. And the question is, can you do it quickly enough? Can you do it within the 2 minutes of time constraint that you have? So this is sort of the diagnostic phase on our platform, is to show you the different types of solutions that are out there, and then to follow it up with improvement and with optimization. So first we asked for feedback, essentially, and sort of this is how we try to learn who you are while you're using the platform. And we do this mainly by the screen that you see in front of you now. So if you get a question correct, we ask you what was the tool that you used, and sort of we've partitioned this into tools that we've found are commonly used among students, and if none of these fit you, then you can add in a different tool. And similarly, if you made a mistake, we try to focus you in onto what types of possible mistakes are there. So what do you think your mistake was in answering the question? And again, you can add your own mistake in there. And again, even if you choose to study by yourself through textbooks or with another platform or whatever, this is a really, really, really important thing, phase for you to go through. So you're not just sort of practicing when you're studying for the GMAT. You're trying to learn, and you're trying to figure out what you got wrong, and you're trying to optimize yourself. So you really need to pause, not necessarily every question, but sort of in, say, 5-question batches, and to ask yourself, you know, sort of how am I doing? What types of things am I getting right? What types of things am I getting wrong? And how can I leverage what I know, and how can I manage what I don't know? And this is the core to improvement, and we'll touch more on this later. And so after we've done all that, then sort of, and we show you the different types of solutions, we also sort of give you a match, sort of based on your feedback so far, based on our experience from other students. This is what we recommend for you in terms of either the fit of the solution or in terms of the timing. So we might recommend a slightly slower solution, for example, if we think it better fits with your mode of work. So that's basically us. There's a whole bunch of statistics behind the scenes with some fancy names, which we won't go into. There's also external acknowledgement, which makes me really happy because it's not just me who likes our program, it's also other people. And there's also students rating, which is honestly the most important part, and you should sort of go and check them out yourselves and not trust me on the students rating. And most importantly, in terms of the platform, then we believe in it strongly enough to offer a success guarantee. And so for those of you who are retakers, we do guarantee a 70-point improvement under certain conditions. And if this is relevant to you, then please go check it out. Okay, so moving back into the core issue of today. So far we've had a little bit of an intro. I've sort of tried to explain to you what we think the GMAT is all about and what we think you should focus on when studying for the GMAT, and also how we've built our platform in order to help you prepare for that. The basic concepts of quant and verbal, someone is asking if I explain. So yes and no. So everything I'm talking about here today is relevant both for quant and for verbal. We're going to show a few techniques for solving a few specific problems in quant, and we're going to show a question in verbal and talking about that. But there really aren't any basic concepts of quant and verbal. You have to realize that there's an entire syllabus. And you can sort of just log on to our website to see, for example, the course trail and see what that syllabus is, or you can look on mba.com. But there aren't any basic quant concepts of quant and verbal other than the basic strategic ones, which I am talking about. So in order to break 700, there need to be 2 factors to your planning. Factor number 1 is cognitive flexibility, which we've talked about a little bit, and we will also talk about a little bit more. And factor number 2 is rapid improvement, which is to say how you can break that plateau. So most students find that once they've been studying for quite a while and they sort of know the ropes, they start to hit a wall, which is to say they get to that point where they just can't break the 600 or the 650 or the 700. And, you know, for each student, it's going to be a different place. And later on, we're going to talk a little bit about how you break that limit. So we've already talked a little bit about what cognitive flexibility is. It's the way that you choose the fastest tool for you. I've briefly mentioned the PAL algorithm. This is the PAL in ExamPal. And precise methods, as you maybe saw from above, are very, very, very equation oriented. So they're basically all about how do I manipulate the equations to get to the answer, or how do I set up, say, rate and work equation, or the overlapping sets equation. Just, sort of translate the given word problem usually into equations, and then go through all of the equations and get to the right answer. Alternative methods, which is sort of the plugging in numbers that we saw before, are things that help you usually to deal with questions that are a little bit above your level, or questions that you think solving rigorously would just take far too long. And so these are tools that get you to the right answer, even though you can't sort of prove mathematically to sort of a really obstinate math professor why your proof is actually correct. And the third sort of broad category of tools that you should acquire that we teach is what we call logical tools. And this is sort of the weighted average, the wordy explanation for the question that we saw before. This is using the underlying fundamental mathematical properties. And again, in verbal, this is a little bit different. We're going to talk about verbal a little bit later. In order to get to the answer without necessarily having to go through all of the equations and without hacking the question either. All right, so let's take an example look, a look at two example questions. And I think I've also talked about this before. So when you're learning to apply the different tools, this is based on question characteristics. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when you talk about optimizing, sort of breaking your own limit, and also about your own strengths and weaknesses. So what sort of methodologies do you prefer? So question number one. And so again, we're going to do what we did before. I'm going to sort of leave the question up here on the board, and I'm going to ask you to type in the chat what you would like to do with this question. You can try solving it, but I'm actually much more interested in how you would approach this question. So let's have it. I'm going to give you a minute or so to read it and think about it and type stuff in the chat. So what do you all think? What do you all think? How would you approach this question? And again, the answer is important. You do need to get to the right answer. But for now, especially for the first timers, especially given this is a learning webinar, what is your approach to solving this question? What do you think? And it's okay to say I don't know, by the way. Like, it's 100% legitimate, and it's 100, and it's an important part of learning is to realize when you just don't know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And again, I encourage you to read on chat what sort of your colleagues are writing. And if you go on various GMAT forums online, then you'll also see similar things. You'll see that different people suggest different solutions for the same question. And again, zooming out to the meta, this is what you need to do if you're aiming for 700 plus. You need to identify the mode of thinking that helps you get to the right answer within 2 minutes. So you do need to learn the actual material as well. It's not just about playing around with tools, but it is quite a lot about learning which tools to use. All right, perfect. So you can see a bunch of different possible solutions in chat, and I'm going to show 2 of them now. And so the first solution approach that I'm going to show is what I labeled before as the precise approach, and this is the equation-oriented approach. So it's just basically straight up calculating. So what I think Tyler wrote, figure out the original number of women, and then new total divided by original number, something like that. So 36% of 900, 36 divided by 100, 900. You can get cancel that out to 36 times 9, which you can either calculate straight up. You can take like a calculation shortcut, like the one on the board. 360 minus 36, you get to 324 women at the wedding. Cool. Hopefully that didn't take you too long. And now we can move on. We can say, well, 450 men left, so none of the women left. So then there are 900 minus 450 guests, 450 guests remaining. And we have the same number of women, so that's 324 over 450. And so as some people said, you can just estimate whatever this is. You can also calculate it. So explicitly calculating this expression would require recognizing that it has a factor of 3, which you can cancel out. And then you get, you cancel that out by 3 again, you get to 36 over 50, which is 72 over 100, which is 72%. All right, so going back to what I said before, every single GMAT question is solvable. And I guarantee you that if you had 5 to 10 minutes at home, you could have gone through all of this math by yourself, and it doesn't matter how good you actually are at math. Because the math here isn't terribly complicated. It's just sometimes a little bit annoying. So, you know, actually solving 324 divided by 450 can be a little unpleasant. And then, as some people said, you can either estimate it, or if you're good at this sort of thing, you can just solve it. And there's a fundamentally different way to approach this question, which I see some of you hinting at in chat. And that is what we like to call a logical approach. And that is to understand that the percentage is the part over the whole. And so if originally the women divided by all of the guests were 36%, and we now have half of the guests. So of the 900 guests originally, 450 men left. So we have half of the guests, and we still have the exact same number of women because none of the women left. So what that means is that our fraction is twice as large. So instead of having the same number of women over twice the guests, you have the same number of women over half the guests, or rather, you know what I mean. And that means you have twice the percentage. And so you increase from 36% to 72%. And this is a much faster way to approach this question. And sort of zooming out for a minute, what we did here is we recognized a logical property, a fundamental mathematical property underlying the question, and we used it. And we also didn't dive straight into the equations. So we first paused for a moment and we asked ourselves, well, I mean, we're talking about the women and we're talking about percentages. Is there a faster way to get to the answer that isn't sort of direct through all of this? And just for a moment, because it's an important question on chat, you would not have a calculator to use for a question like this. Emphatically, no, you do not have a calculator on the GMAT at all, except for the integrated reasoning section. So every single calculation that you see in this PowerPoint presentation or on your own Sketchpad or on the forums or wherever you used to study from is something that you either need to do in your head or you need to do with pencil and paper. And so, again, this goes onto your own personal set of skills. So if you're really, really good with equations, then, you know, maybe dividing 324 by 450 is a piece of cake. And you may as well do it because it can, it's usually much more, let's call it solid. The precise methods are usually much more solid than the other ones because here you're sort of trying to logically abstract things in your mind, and it can be a little bit confusing sometimes. And just putting things into equations make them much more concrete. And so at any rate, what we did here is we paused, and before jumping straight into the equations, we sort of asked ourselves, how could we get to this answer? And this is the decision-making process that I talked about. So when you look at a question, within the first 10 to 20 seconds, you need to be able to arrive at a decision. And that decision is, do I skip this question or not? And if you choose not to skip this question, how do I approach this question? And then you sort of, once you've made that decision, you lock down and you just do it and you stop thinking. And that's sort of the general time management and strategy for answering GMAT questions in general. Okay, so let's look at another one. Oh, right, and then, so this is a question that's actually on our website. So I have data for it. And comparing the two solutions, then as you might expect, one takes much, much less time than the other. And then factored into this time is, of course, how long it takes you to read and think and so on and so forth. So this is the average overall students who answered this question on our website. And so let's look at another question. And so once again, there are many different ways to solve the question. So take a look, see what you think, and let me know on chat. So you have a minute or two to read this question and to comment on it. All right, so what do y'all think? What do y'all think? Some are suggesting a solution, but I'm more interested, especially in this webinar, in the methodology. Cool. Cool. So using the answers is one methodology. What other methodologies are there that you would think of that look good to you for solving this question? Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing some people suggest expanding and reducing the ratios. So instead of looking at 15 minutes or 10 minutes, you can look at 1 minute or 5 minutes or so on. And I think we're going to move on. I think I'm just going to solve the question. So there is, of course, a precise method, a precise way to solve this question. There are shorter and longer ways to do it. The longer way, which is usually what most people do, especially when they're starting out, is to sort of bring everything down to it. So if I have a printer that does 80 pages in 15 minutes, then that's going to be 80 divided by 15 pages per minute, whatever that is. And the laser printer that prints 100 pages every 10 minutes, that's going to be 100 divided by 10, which is 10 pages per minute. So you know how much both printers do per minute. And then you sort of have to work back through all of the math to realize, to figure out how long it's going to take them to do 230 pages. And it is, of course, working at the same time. And the other way to do it, which is also sort of an equation-oriented approach, but is less involved technically, is to look for an easier common denominator. So instead of reducing both printers to 1 minute, it's going to look for a number of minutes, which makes the math easier. So in this case, for example, we can pick 30 minutes, or we can pick 5 minutes, as someone suggested in chat. So if we look at how many printers the inkjet printer does, it does 160 pages in 30 minutes, and the laser printer does 300 pages in 30 minutes, and all of a sudden your math becomes much easier. And in both methods, you eventually get to answer B, which is 15. And what I'm going to show here is I'm going to show an alternative approach. And this is especially for those of you who don't like working with equations or aren't 100% sure how to translate this specific equation into the specific question, into equations or so on and so forth. And that is using the answers, which is what one person wrote in chat. And so when you're using the answers, you can either start with a median, which is usually C, in this case 18, or you can look for an easy number, sort of what would an easy number to plug in be from the answers. And in this case, I just chose to start with 10 because it looks like a really easy number to calculate. So let's say that we had 10 minutes for both of the printers to print 230 pages. So we know that the inkjet printer prints 80 pages in 15 minutes. So, you know, we're going to guess this at this stage. We're not going to calculate it, but it's going to be a bit more than half, not too much more than half. It's going to be about 60 pages. So that's more or less what the inkjet printer did. The laserjet printer is really easy. I mean, if we had 10 minutes, then of course it printed 100 pages, and you can see right away that that's not enough. So even if our calculations aren't exact, and they don't need to be exact for this, we're at about 160 pages, which is way, way less than what we need. So it's definitely not going to be A. And now we sort of need to choose the next answer to try out. And usually when we're picking answers, we're going to look for a certain trend. So for example, in this case, we didn't take the median, but had we taken the median, then we could have either decided to go higher or lower. In this case, we arrived at about 160. We need to get to about 230. So we need something which is not double the amount. It's maybe 1.5 times the amount or something like that. So B15 looks like a reasonable guess. And so that's what we're going to do. So we're going to say, well, okay, let's say B is the answer. And then it took 15 minutes. So then the inkjet printer printed 80 pages exactly. The laser printer printed 100 pages times 1.5, that's 150 pages. And voila, we have arrived at exactly 230 pages. We have arrived at our answer. And for this specific question, this is a very, very short way, an easy way to get to the answer. So especially if you find the sort of the ratio type of thing confusing, and if you're aiming for 700, you really need to learn it, because ratios and proportions is one of the basic concepts underlying many GMAT questions. And this is really important to say at this point, that alternative methods, sort of hacking the question in various ways, are not replacements for knowing material. They're supplements. So they help you deal with a question faster. They can help you solve questions you don't know how to deal with, but you cannot base your GMAT program on just learning how to break the question. But at any rate, for this specific question, this is a very fast method and it gets you to the right answer, and it does so quickly. So this is a different type of tool. So we didn't solve the question here. I can't explain to you sort of, if you were to change the numbers, I wouldn't know how to do the math so as to get to the right answer. But it doesn't matter, because I got to the right answer, and so the GMAT test writers are happy. All right. So we've gone through the general idea of the algorithm, and again, moving back to cognitive flexibility, what I'm trying to aim you towards in your GMAT studies is that you need to build up your toolbox. You need to build up the number of tools with which you can approach different questions. You need to figure out which tools you work with quickly and which tools you work with correctly. This is what we aim to teach, and this is how we've structured our program, and this is what you should also do, in my opinion. The second part of breaking the 700 barrier is mastering the rapid improvement. And this is sort of what you do when you've hit that wall, what you do when you've hit that 600 or the 650 or wherever it is that you're stuck at, how you break through that. And usually, this is not about doing more of the same. So this is not about just going again and practicing and reading everything and so on and so forth. It is about recognizing that mistakes are opportunities. And it is generally about trying to research every single mistake and trying to figure out why you made that mistake. So I'm trying to categorize the mistake. And in this case, we usually like to divide mistakes into 3 different meta categories. The first is a professional mistake. And this is what, and what I mean by this is a fundamental lack of knowledge about the material. So you just did not know, I don't know, the basic Pythagorean theorem. You did not know that specific word of vocabulary. You did not know the rule linking, I don't know, powers or exponents or whatever it is. You just didn't know something. And this is, as far as I'm concerned, a professional mistake, which means that you need to go back to your books and you just need to study. There's no like no room for maneuvering there. The second type of mistake is technical. So this is a type of mistake where you know the material, but you made some sort of, I don't know, scratch pad error. You wrote a plus instead of a minus. You flipped around the equations. You marked B instead of C. You answered the wrong question, and you would be surprised how often this happens, especially in verbal. When people sort of look at a question and they understand what they need to do, but instead of, excuse me, I don't know, answering about muskrats in Alaska, they ask about muskrats in Canada. Something that's very, very similar, but not quite what GMAT is asking about. And for example, usually the type of solution suggested for this type of error would be to just take a few seconds. So right before you jump into calculations, to take a few seconds to make sure that you've read all the assumptions correctly, that you've written the equations down correctly, that you've prepared the base correctly. And just before hitting the next button, to make sure that you have marked the question that you intended to mark, to make sure that you have answered the question that you were asked, just to do due diligence for your work. And again, you can't do this for every question because time is of the issue. but you should learn to recognize which questions give you problems. And this is where rapid improvement really comes into play. And as you know, sort of, I don't know what specific score each one of you needs for admissions. And this is also a point to say where I don't actually care what the score you get is. I care that the score that you get is high enough to get you into whatever school you want to go to. And that should be your focus as well. So if your school needs a 650, then, you know, screw the 700, there's no point in getting it. If the school needs a 740, then you have a lot of work cut out for you. And to do this, it takes time. It's usually worth your while to sort of just go online or in our blogs, and there are GMAT score calculators. And you can see what combination of quant and verbal you should aim for in order to get the score that you need. And so this will really help to focus you in on what you should aim for. And so anyways, to go back to this specific slide, technical mistakes are often the really annoying type of silly mistakes that are all about focus and all about careful work, and have quite a lot to do with how, you know, good and how high of a score you really need to get. The third type of mistake is what we call a strategic mistake. And this is a mistake of I chose the wrong approach for a specific question. So I got lost in calculations instead of looking at the answer. I read through all of the answers in verbal and confused myself instead of thinking ahead like in advance. In sentence correction, I spent way too long sort of arguing with myself over which of the two answer choices sounds better to me. There are many different types of strategic mistakes, but basically it boils down to you didn't choose the right approach, or you didn't cut your losses and move on fast enough. And sort of this is developing your metacognition. So again, we're not talking about learning the material. We're sort of, to go back to the previous slide, we're talking about when you've sort of improved, and then you've hit a wall. And this wall is usually not about learning more. It's about optimizing yourself. And this is how you should do it. And then, of course, you should seek out this to implement, to sort of to actually take your error log that you've built up throughout your course and the list of mistakes, and to sort of implement it on additional questions. I think we've gone through this. And then the last part, and we're sort of going to be into the Q&A in a second. So if you have any questions, or then, you know, prepare them and feel free to ask. So anyways, the last part of actually getting to the 700 is well, actually getting there. So how do you build a plan, and how do you stick to a plan? So usually we recommend a medium intensity course, so about 120 hours over 6 to 8 weeks. This translates into something like 15 hours a week. And sort of we go by week and not by day, because some of you may prefer to study over the weekend or over specific days, like I don't know your specific work schedules and so on and so forth. But we certainly don't recommend that you spread your preparation over 3 to 4 months. Usually what happens with people who do is that they forget what they studied at the start. So, you know, if you studied something in the first week and then you know, spend 2 months doing a whole bunch of other stuff, by the time you get to the end, you won't remember what you did at the start. And there's sort of a breakdown on the board here over how we recommend you, you know, spend your time. But sort of basically this boils down to just going, at least with us, going over the course trail. So sort of when you start your course, then you input the due date, so when your exam is, and then sort of we structure the scheduling for you. And all you really have to do is follow the trail along the first 50 days or so. And we sort of recommend splitting it into sections. So sort of take a day to study the material, then go through the algorithm methodology, or sort of focusing on yourself. And things are built in layers, you know. So stuff that is right at the start in integers is used throughout the quant course later on. And so don't worry if you feel you haven't practiced enough on a specific topic, because you'll see more of it later on. And there's a really important comment on the board here that I mentioned briefly before, and I want to emphasize again. Reading speed, and in general, how quickly you can interpret information is a really big part of success on the GMAT. And we do recommend that you have a daily reading schedule, not of novels necessarily, or of yellow pages, or whatever it is, but of, let's call it quality reading material, which is sort of academic style reading material. And this is the type of reading passage that you'll see on the GMAT. So sort of this is what you're aiming for. And we have, several suggested reading materials, sources for reading materials on our website. In general, it's stuff like The Economist or National Geographic, or I don't know, Scientific American or The Times. It's sort of respectable publications, usually with a small, let's call it sciencey bent or economics bent to them. That is what we would recommend. Take a day off a week. So I don't know how many of you work all day every day, but it sort of fries your brain, and you do need to rest, and just do stuff you enjoy. And so once you've done all that, once you've gone over the ropes, you need to have a review of the material, and which is not to say that you don't review the material while you're studying, but it is to say that after you've gone through everything, you should leave yourself just a week just for reviewing. And this is a really good point to talk about the practice cats. I'll get to the question in a second, to the questions in chat. This is a really good point to talk about your practice exam. So many people use the practice exam as sort of a measure. So how far along am I? Am I at the 650 level now? I'm at the 680, I'm at the 720, like where am I now? And while this is a very important part of the CAT, it's not the most important part of the CAT. The most important part of the CAT is to sort of bring it all together. So the CAT, the practice exam, the official practice exam is where you put your timing strategies to the test, is where you put your guessing strategies to the test. It's where you put, is where you test your levels of focus. Can you stay focused for long enough to do the actual exam? And this is why when you take practice CAT, you should do it in one chunk if possible. So set aside the 3 hours, preferably at the same time of day as your actual GMAT. Just do the exam in one go, sort of without phone, without interruption, without anything else. And you really want to see how good you are in conditions as close to the real exam as possible. And once you're done with that, take the time to debug your practice exam. So it's not just about the score. It's even not primarily about the score. It's about what mistakes you made during the exam. It's about, did you run out of time at the end? Because that means you should skip more questions along the way. It was about, were there specific questions that you didn't notice and just got into a time sink? You just wasted 5 to 6 minutes on them. In that case, that means you should be more stringent with your timing. And usually problems have to do with timing in the practice exams. It was about, did you make a lot of silly mistakes? And so either learn to use your Scratchpad or choose to skip more questions in order to give you more time for each individual question, which will sort of narrow down the silly mistake window. So all these types of things, all this sort of strategy testing is the main thing that you should use your practice exam for. And it's really important that you do so because that's the best preparation for the exam that you have. And then of course, review everything, review the weak sections and so on and so forth. Keeping an error log is really important. I hinted at it, I don't think I said it explicitly before. So all throughout your studies, you should have, your favorite Google Sheet or Excel sheet or notebook or however you work. With sort of the types of mistakes that you've made so far. And this sort of is the basis on which you do your reviews and on which you improve. The goal is to learn and don't make the same mistakes again. And once you've gone through all of that, then take the last day off, have a snooze, do whatever you do that sort of keeps you energized. And you can think of this as a star athlete. That's sort of the analogy that I like to use. You are a star athlete. This is the main sporting event that you're aiming for. And you should treat it as such. So the day off, you don't want to do any sort of strenuous activity, but you sort of do want to maybe do a few warm-ups. So, go over the material a little bit, do a few easy questions. You want to have a good breakfast. You want to be energetic on the GMAT day. Yeah, and then you can go crush it like the star athlete that you are. Right. So that's basically the webinar for today. So just to sum up, the key goals, the strategic goals, the strategic way to get to the 700 plus is A, to build a toolbox, to learn which tools work best for you, which questions to apply the to, and so on and so forth. It is rapid improvement, especially when you've hit that wall, and that is to recognize what you're doing wrong and how to fix it, and not just to do more of the same. It is also about building that study plan and then sticking to that study plan.
ExamPal,